In ancient Egypt, a poor enslaved woman named Kamwaset spent her last 3 gold coins to purchase what everyone called a worthless ruin. The crumbling pyramid sat abandoned on the outskirts of Memphis, its limestone blocks scattered and its entrance sealed with rubble. Merchants laughed at her foolishness. Fellow slaves shook their heads in pity. Even her own son questioned why she would waste their only wealth on stones and sand. But Kamwaset saw something others missed in the forgotten monument. She had heard whispers from old workers who built the great tombs, stories of hidden chambers and secret passages that the royal architects never recorded. Years passed and the pyramid remained her family's burden until her curious son began exploring its dark corridors with nothing but oil lamps and determination. What could a slave woman have possibly seen in a pile of ancient stones that would change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Kamwaset had learned to read by accident, a skill that should have remained forever beyond the reach of a house slave in Memphis. Her master, Amenhotep the grain merchant, had grown careless with his scrolls as age clouded his vision. While cleaning his study, she had begun to recognize the hieroglyphic symbols that marked quantities and prices. Curiosity had driven her to decode more complex texts during the long hours when the household slept. The discovery that changed everything came on a morning when Amenhotep had left his personal correspondence scattered across his writing table. Among the mundane business letters lay something extraordinary, a fragment of papyrus that showed the incomplete layout of pyramid chambers. The map had been torn, presumably discarded as worthless. But to Kamwaset's trained eye, it revealed secrets that generations of tomb robbers had missed. The fragment showed passages that led not to the main burial chamber, but to smaller rooms hidden within the pyramid's very foundation. These weren't marked on any official architectural plans she'd glimpsed in her master's collection of building documents. Someone had drawn these additions by hand, perhaps a foreman or master builder recording modifications made during construction that were never meant to be permanent records. Kamwaset studied the fragment for weeks, memorizing every line and symbol before carefully returning it to the pile of discarded papers. She researched the pyramid it depicted through conversations with old construction workers who visited her master's compound, men who had spent their lives hauling stones and mixing mortar for the royal tombs. They spoke of abandoned projects, monuments begun with great fanfare, but left unfinished when pharaohs died unexpectedly or political situations shifted. The pyramid on the outskirts of Memphis had been one such failure. Begun for a pharaoh whose reign lasted only 3 years, it had been hastily sealed when court intrigue led to his mysterious death. Workers had been dismissed, architects reassigned, and the monument left to decay while more pressing royal projects demanded attention and resources. But the fragment suggested something different. The additional chambers weren't part of the original design. They had been carved secretly, perhaps by workers who knew the true fate of their pharaoh and wanted to preserve something the official historians would try to erase. These rooms might contain treasures, but more importantly, they might hold answers to questions that could reshape the understanding of recent royal succession. Kamwaset began planning her desperate gamble with the methodical precision of a military campaign. She saved every copper piece from her meager allowances, collected the small gifts sometimes given by her master's grateful clients, and carefully sold personal possessions without arousing suspicion. The 3 gold coins represented months of sacrifice and calculation, but they would be enough to purchase the abandoned pyramid from a land scribe eager to clear worthless property from his records. Her son Keti watched these preparations with growing alarm. At 12 years old, he understood that his mother was risking their security on what appeared to be fantasy. They had shelter, however humble, within her master's compound. They had food, clothing, and the relative safety that came with being useful to a successful merchant. Why would she throw away their stability for ownership of ruins that offered no obvious benefit? The night before the transaction, Kamwaset sat with her son in their small quarters, trying to explain without revealing the dangerous knowledge that drove her decision. Sometimes, she told him. "We must choose between the comfort of certainty and the possibility of something better. I have seen signs that others have missed. This pyramid holds more than broken stones and empty chambers." Keti remained unconvinced, but he was too young to prevent his mother's plans and too dependent on her care to abandon her completely. When morning came, he watched her count out the 3 gold coins with steady hands, each piece representing their entire future wagered on secrets hidden in crumbling limestone. The land scribe accepted the payment with barely concealed amusement. He provided the necessary documents of ownership with the casual efficiency of someone disposing of a worthless burden. To him, Kamwasit was simply another desperate slave making a foolish decision, but her money was as valuable as anyone else's. That evening, mother and son loaded their few possessions onto a borrowed cart and made the journey to their new home. The pyramid loomed against the sunset sky like a broken tooth, its once smooth sides now rough, with missing stones and accumulated debris. But Kamwasit looked at the ruins with satisfaction rather than regret. Hidden somewhere within that deteriorating monument lay the key to transforming her son's future from slavery to something she dared not yet name aloud. The pyramid stood like a wounded giant against the desert sky, its original height reduced by centuries of stone thieves and natural erosion. What had once been a perfect geometric monument now resembled a stepped hill, with massive limestone blocks scattered around its base like the bones of some ancient beast. The outer casing stones had long since been carted away for other construction projects, leaving the rough inner core exposed to wind and sand. Kamwasit walked slowly around the perimeter, her trained eye cataloguing details that others would dismiss as mere decay. The construction showed signs of desperate haste, irregularly cut stones forced into place, mortar applied too thickly to compensate for poor fitting, and most tellingly evidence that work had stopped abruptly rather than following the usual careful completion procedure. The entrance that should have faced north had been sealed not with the customary fitted stones and religious inscriptions, but with rough rubble hastily piled and mortared. This wasn't the respectful closing of a completed tomb, but the panicked boarding up of something that needed to be hidden quickly. The very carelessness of the sealing suggested that whoever had ordered it cared more about concealment than proper religious protocol. As twilight approached, Kamwasit and Keti made their first camp in the shadow of the pyramid. They had brought supplies for several days, enough time to assess their new circumstances and begin the work of making the site habitable. Keti gathered fallen stones to create a windbreak, while his mother prepared their evening meal over a small fire of desert scrub. The first night proved more challenging than either had anticipated. Desert winds carried sand that found its way into their food, their bedding, and every fold of their clothing. The temperature dropped dramatically after sunset, forcing them to huddle together for warmth, despite their proximity to the fire. Strange sounds echoed from within the pyramid, not supernatural manifestations, but the natural settling of ancient stones and the scurrying of small creatures that had made the ruins their home. Dawn revealed their new domain more clearly. The pyramid sat on a low rise that provided excellent views of the surrounding desert and the distant Nile Valley. Memphis gleamed in the morning light, close enough to reach for supplies, but far enough away to provide privacy for whatever work lay ahead. Other ancient monuments dotted the landscape, smaller tombs and mastabas that had fared better than their pyramid, suggesting that location wasn't the only factor in its abandonment. While exploring the debris field around the pyramid's base, Kamwasit made her first significant discovery. Partially buried beneath centuries of accumulated sand, she found a limestone block that had clearly fallen from somewhere higher in the structure. What made it remarkable was the carving on its exposed face, a royal cartouche bearing hieroglyphs she didn't recognize. The name spelled out in the ancient symbols wasn't familiar from any of the royal lists she'd studied in her master's scrolls. The style was correct for the period when the pyramid should have been built, but the pharaoh it identified seemed to have been erased from official record. This wasn't simply a matter of damaged inscriptions or weathered stone. Someone had deliberately attempted to remove all traces of this ruler from history. Keti found his mother staring intently at the carved stone, her fingers tracing the hieroglyphs with reverent care. "What does it say?" asked, his curiosity overcoming his lingering resentment about their circumstances. "It's a name that shouldn't exist," Kamoset replied quietly. "A pharaoh who ruled but was forgotten, whose monuments were abandoned, and whose memory was supposed to disappear." She looked up at the pyramid with new understanding. This wasn't just left unfinished, it was deliberately hidden. As they worked to establish their primitive shelter among the scattered stones, other evidence of the pyramid's mysterious history began to emerge. Workers in the area spoke in whispers about the site's reputation for bringing misfortune to those who disturbed it. Local villagers avoided the ruins, crossing themselves and muttering protective prayers when forced to pass nearby. Even the stone thieves who had stripped so many other monuments had left this one largely untouched, as if some unspoken agreement kept them away. The stories varied in their details, but shared common themes of strange lights seen flickering within the pyramid at night, of voices speaking ancient words that echoed from chambers thought to be empty, and of workers who had ventured inside during previous centuries and emerged changed if they emerged at all. Kamoset listened to these tales with the skepticism of an educated mind, but she also recognized that superstition often preserved kernels of historical truth that official records had chosen to forget. Hetty's embarrassment burned deeper than the desert sun as he walked the dusty path between the pyramid and the nearest village. The other children his age lived in proper houses with mud brick walls and thatched roofs, not in makeshift shelters cobbled together from ancient rubble. When they asked where he lived, he learned to mumble vague answers about helping his mother with work near the monuments, hoping they wouldn't press for details. The mockery came anyway, as it always did among children who sensed weakness or difference. "Pyramid Boy," they called him, laughing at his patched clothing and the fine stone dust that seemed permanently embedded in his hair and under his fingernails. Some claimed he smelled like the dead, others whispered that his family must be cursed to choose such a dwelling place. The cruelest suggested that his mother had lost her mind, spending their last coins on worthless ruins when they could have found proper shelter in the city. But Kamwast refused to let their circumstances interrupt her son's education. Each morning, after their simple breakfast of bread and dates, she would produce the clay tablet she had carefully preserved through their transition. The tablet bore practice exercises in hieroglyphic writing, lessons she had painstakingly copied from scrolls in her former master's collection. She was determined that Keti would learn to read and write, skills that could elevate him far beyond the status of a slave's son. The lessons took place in the shade of the pyramid's north face, where fallen stones created natural seats and writing surfaces. The Kamoset would trace hieroglyphs in the sand, explaining their meanings and showing Keti how to form the symbols with proper proportion and clarity. The tablet served as his practice surface, its clay surface smoothed and reused countless times as he struggled to master the complex script. These educational sessions revealed the depth of his mother's learning, knowledge that seemed impossible for someone of her social status. She didn't simply know how to read basic symbols, she understood grammar, religious terminology, and even some of the archaic forms used in ancient texts. When Keti asked how she had acquired such extensive education, she would deflect with gentle reminders to focus on his own studies. The pyramid itself became part of their classroom as Kamoset pointed out architectural features and explained their significance. She taught Keti to recognize the different types of stone used in construction, to understand how the massive blocks had been cut and transported, and to appreciate the mathematical precision required to create such monuments. These lessons transformed the ruins from a source of shame into a fascinating puzzle that demanded investigation. Keti's initial attempts to explore the pyramid's interior were frustrated by the sealed entrances and accumulated debris. The main passage had been so thoroughly blocked with rubble that even determining its exact location proved challenging. Sand and fallen stones had created an almost impenetrable barrier that would require careful excavation to breach safely. But his mother's mysterious confidence about hidden treasures gradually infected his own imagination. She spoke with such certainty about secrets waiting to be discovered, about knowledge that could transform their circumstances, that Ketty began to believe that their poverty and isolation might be temporary conditions rather than permanent fate. If his mother was right, if the pyramid truly contained something valuable, then his current embarrassment might be justified by future revelations. The clay tablet became more than just a learning tool. It became a symbol of possibilities that literacy could provide. As Ketty's skill with hieroglyphs improved, he began to understand that knowledge was a form of power that couldn't be taken away by circumstances or social status. The children who mocked him for living among ruins couldn't read the inscriptions on the very monuments that surrounded their village. They were dependent on others to interpret the written world, while he was developing the ability to unlock secrets directly. During their evening conversations, Camwaset would hint at the greater purpose behind their situation. She spoke of patience, of preparation, and of opportunities that revealed themselves only to those who were ready to recognize them. She reminded Ketty that many great discoveries had been made by people who were willing to look where others wouldn't, to investigate what others dismissed as worthless. Gradually, Ketty's resentment began to transform into curiosity. The pyramid that had initially seemed like a burden imposed by his mother's folly started to feel like a challenge waiting to be solved. If there truly were hidden chambers and forgotten treasures within those ancient walls, then perhaps he was uniquely positioned to be the one who found them. The mockery of village children seemed less important when measured against the possibility of discoveries that could shock the entire kingdom. The old man appeared at their makeshift camp on a morning when the desert wind carried the scent of distant rain. Ketty noticed him first, a bent figure moving slowly between the scattered stones, using a walking stick to test his footing on the uneven ground. His weathered face bore the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades working under the harsh Egyptian sun, and his hands showed the calluses and scars of a lifetime handling stone and metal tools. "You are the woman who bought the cursed pyramid," he said without preamble, settling himself on a fallen block with the careful movements of advanced age. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard despite his humble appearance. "I am Seneb, son of Ketty the quarryman, grandson of Amenemheb, who cut stones for 3 pharaohs." Camwaset studied the unexpected visitor with cautious interest. Men of his apparent age and experience didn't typically seek out conversations with slave women living among ruins. His presence suggested either curiosity about their activities or knowledge that might prove valuable or dangerous. She offered him water from their precious supply and waited for him to reveal his purpose. "My father worked on this pyramid," Seneb continued, accepting the water with a grateful nod. "Not officially, that ended when the pharaoh died so suddenly, but he came back later in secret with a small crew of trusted men. They had been paid well to forget what they built, but my father was never good at forgetting." The old man's eyes fixed on Ketty with unexpected intensity. "The boy has his great-grandfather's name. Perhaps that is not coincidence." The revelation that connected Ketty's name to one of the pyramid's original builders sent an electric thrill through the young man. He had been named for his mother's grandfather, a man he had never met, but whose reputation for skill with tools and stone had been passed down through family stories. To learn that this ancestor might have worked on their very pyramid felt like destiny revealing itself through seemingly random connection. Seneb proved reluctant to share details at first, explaining that the workers had been sworn to secrecy about their activities and that breaking such oaths could bring consequences even decades later. But Camwaset's obvious education and her son's eager questions gradually loosened his tongue. The stories he told painted a picture of political intrigue and religious controversy that had shaped the pyramid's construction and abandonment. The pharaoh buried within hadn't died of natural causes or battlefield wounds, according to the whispered account Seneb had heard from his father. Court records spoke of sudden illness, but workers who had prepared the burial chamber reported signs of violence, damaged grave goods, hastily repaired decorations, and most tellingly, a sarcophagus that bore evidence of being opened and resealed after the original interment. They wanted people to think he was forgotten. Seneb explained, his voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private, despite the empty landscape around them. New pharaoh, new dynasty, old problems buried with old kings. But my father said the real treasure wasn't gold or jewels, it was proof. Documents that showed the truth about succession, about who had the right to rule. As their conversation continued, Seneb reached into the leather pouch he carried and withdrew an object that made Keti's breath catch, an iron chisel, its blade worn smooth by countless hours of use, but still sharp enough for delicate work. The tool bore maker's marks that identified it as coming from the royal workshops, equipment reserved for the most important construction projects. This belonged to my father and his father before him, Seneb said, holding the chisel with reverent care. It cut stones for pharaohs whose names are carved in temples throughout the kingdom. But its last work was here, in secret chambers that don't appear on any architect's plans. He extended the tool toward Keti. Perhaps it is time for it to finish what it started. The weight of the chisel in Keti's hands felt significant beyond its physical mass. The iron was smooth with age, but still solid, the wooden handle worn to fit comfortably in a worker's grip. He could imagine generations of craftsmen using this same tool to shape stone, to create the monuments that defined their civilization's greatest achievements. Seneb's gift came with obligations, as well as opportunities. The old man extracted promises that any discoveries would be handled with discretion, that the dangerous political implications would be considered carefully before any revelations were made public. The pyramid held secrets that could destabilize the current dynasty if revealed carelessly, and the consequences of such disruption would fall heaviest on those least able to protect themselves. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pyramid's base as Keti approached the sealed entrance with Seneb's chisel in one hand and grim determination in his heart. His mother had left early to gather supplies from the village market, giving him the privacy he needed for what might prove to be either breakthrough or disaster. The accumulated rubble that blocked the main passage had taunted him for weeks, but armed with proper tools and knowledge passed down from the pyramid's original builders, he felt ready to attempt what others had deemed impossible. The entrance wasn't completely hidden. Careful observation revealed subtle differences in the way stones had been placed, areas where mortar had been applied more hastily than elsewhere, and most importantly, spaces between blocks that suggested hollow chambers beyond. He began his work methodically, using the chisel to probe weak points in the barrier, testing each stone's stability before attempting to remove it. The labor proved more demanding than his youthful enthusiasm had anticipated. Each block weighed more than he could lift alone, requiring careful leverage and patient maneuvering to extract, without causing dangerous collapses. His hands blistered despite his previous experience with tools, and sweat stung his eyes as the sun climbed higher in the desert sky. But gradual progress rewarded his persistence. Loose stones began to shift, revealing glimpses of darkness beyond. By midday, Keti had cleared a narrow opening just large enough for a person to squeeze through if they were willing to risk the unstable rubble overhead. The gap revealed a descending passage that disappeared into absolute darkness, its floor littered with debris from centuries of neglect. The air that emerged from the opening carried the musty scent of ancient stone and something else, a metallic tang that might have been bronze or iron corroding in the dry desert atmosphere. His first venture into the pyramid's interior required lighting, so Keti prepared oil lamps with the careful attention his mother had taught him for any dangerous undertaking. The flames would consume precious oxygen in the confined spaces, so he would need to work quickly and efficiently. He also gathered rope, knowing that the passage's condition might require him to retreat rapidly if structural problems became apparent. The descent through the cleared opening felt like entering another world. The passage beyond was cut directly from bedrock, its walls bearing chisel marks that testified to the skill of ancient craftsmen. but the workmanship showed signs of haste. Surfaces that should have been polished smooth remained rough, and the passage's dimensions varied slightly as if workers had been forced to adapt their plans during construction. 20 paces down the descending corridor, Ketty encountered the first chamber. The room was small, clearly never intended for burial use, and filled with debris that suggested it had served as a storage area during construction. Among the rubble of broken pottery and rotted rope, his lamplight revealed something that made his pulse quicken: a bronze prying bar, its surface green with age but its form still recognizable. The tool was longer and heavier than Sineb's chisel, designed for moving massive stones rather than delicate carving work. Its discovery suggested that the chamber had been used by workers who needed to make structural modifications, perhaps opening passages that weren't part of the original design. The bronze bar's presence meant that serious construction work had continued even after the pyramid's official abandonment. Testing the tool's strength, Ketty found it still sound despite its age. The bronze had developed a patina that actually protected the metal beneath, and the bar's balance remained perfect for leveraging heavy objects. Armed with both the chisel for precision work and the prying bar for major excavation, he felt equipped to tackle obstacles that would have stopped him before. Evidence throughout the chamber supported Sineb's stories about secret construction work. The rubble included fragments of limestone that had been carved with hieroglyphs, then deliberately broken to obscure their meaning. Pottery shards bore traces of ink that suggested written records had been destroyed along with the vessels that contained them. Most tellingly, the chamber showed signs of having been cleared and sealed multiple times, as if workers had returned repeatedly to hide evidence of their activities. The bronze prying bar became both tool and symbol of his commitment to uncovering the pyramid's secrets. Its weight in his hands connected him to the anonymous craftsmen who had risked their lives to preserve something worth hiding from powerful enemies. Whatever lay deeper in the pyramid's passages, Ketty now possessed the means to reach it. Beyond the first chamber, the pyramid's passages split into a maze of corridors that seemed designed to confuse and misdirect intruders. Ketty discovered that many of the tunnels led to dead ends or chambers filled with rubble, clever deceptions that would frustrate casual explorers while protecting the pyramid's true secrets. The builders had invested enormous effort in creating false passages that appeared promising but ultimately revealed nothing of value. Armed with his oil lamp and the bronze prying bar, Ketty began the methodical process of mapping the pyramid's interior. He scratched marks on the walls to indicate passages he had already explored, noting which directions led to promising discoveries and which ended in disappointment. The work required patience and careful attention to detail, as becoming lost in the labyrinthine passages could prove fatal. In the third false chamber he investigated, Ketty made a discovery that sent chills through his body, despite the pyramid's stifling heat. Lying among the construction debris was a small amulet carved from dark stone, its surface inscribed with protective hieroglyphs that seemed to glow in the flickering lamplight. The amulet bore symbols he recognized from his mother's lessons, spells designed to guard against evil spirits and protect the bearer from supernatural harm. The guardian amulet's presence suggested that the pyramid's builders had feared more than physical intrusion. The protective spells carved into its surface were typically reserved for burial chambers, where the dead required defense against malevolent forces. Finding such an object in a construction area implied that workers had believed they were dealing with dangerous supernatural influences that required careful protection. More disturbing were the hieroglyphic warnings carved directly into the passage wall. Unlike the formal inscriptions found in royal tombs, these messages had been scratched hastily by someone who wanted to leave urgent warnings for future visitors. The texts spoke of curses that followed those who disturbed the pyramid's secrets, of ancient powers that should remain undisturbed, and of consequences that would extend far beyond the individual who broke the seal. Ketty's growing skill at reading hieroglyphs allowed him to decipher most of these warnings, though their archaic forms and religious terminology challenged his understanding. The messages weren't simply superstitious threats. They contained specific references to political dangers and historical knowledge that could prove deadly to anyone who discovered it. The warnings suggested that the pyramid contained evidence of crimes committed by people still powerful enough to eliminate threats to their security. The deeper passages revealed increasingly sophisticated attempts at concealment and misdirection. False walls had been constructed to hide genuine entrances, while obvious doorways led to chambers containing nothing but ancient construction materials. The builders had clearly invested enormous resources in creating a structure that would protect its secrets, even from determined investigation. Keti's mother grew increasingly anxious as his explorations extended deeper into the pyramid and required longer absences from their camp. She had initially encouraged his curiosity, but the discovery of protective amulets and warning inscriptions forced her to confront the possibility that their investigation might be awakening forces better left undisturbed. The pyramid's reputation for bringing misfortune to those who disturbed it began to seem less like superstition and more like historical fact. The Guardian Amulet became a constant companion during Keti's underground explorations. Whether its protective powers were real or merely psychological, the small carved stone provided comfort during the long hours spent navigating dark passages where every shadow might conceal danger. The amulet's weight in his palm reminded him that previous explorers had faced the same fears and uncertainties he now experienced. Preparing for each day's work required careful attention to safety measures that his mother insisted upon despite her growing concern. Multiple oil lamps provided backup illumination if primary lights failed, while rope allowed safe navigation of passages where loose stones might shift underfoot. Fresh air became a constant concern in the deeper chambers, forcing Keti to retreat regularly to the surface to avoid the disorientation that could prove fatal in the maze-like interior. The pyramid's interior began to feel like a living entity that actively resisted investigation. Passages that had been clear on previous visits would be found blocked with fallen stones, while chambers that seemed empty would reveal new details under different lighting conditions. Whether these changes resulted from natural settling or supernatural intervention, they created an atmosphere of constant uncertainty that tested Keti's resolve. Yet the Guardian Amulet and its protective inscriptions also suggested that the pyramid's builders had expected someone to eventually penetrate their defenses. The warnings weren't designed to prevent all investigation. They were meant to ensure that only someone with proper knowledge and preparation would reach the innermost secrets. After days of navigating false passages and dead-end chambers, Keti discovered something that made his hands tremble as he held his oil lamp higher for better illumination. Deep within the pyramid's heart, concealed behind a wall that had been constructed to look like natural rock, stood a doorway that bore the unmistakable signs of royal sealing. Unlike the hasty barriers that blocked the pyramid's outer passages, this entrance had been closed with ceremonial precision and marked with official cartouches that proclaimed its sacred nature. The sealed doorway was constructed from perfectly fitted limestone blocks, their joints so precise that not even a knife blade could slip between them. Most remarkably, the clay seal that secured the entrance remained completely intact, bearing the pressed impression and royal cartouche that should not have existed according to any historical records Keti had studied with his mother. The pharaoh's name pressed into that clay was the same mysterious ruler whose cartouche they had discovered on the fallen stone at the pyramid's base. The preservation of the seal presented both an opportunity and a terrifying responsibility. Breaking it would provide access to whatever lay beyond, but destroying such an artifact would also eliminate crucial historical evidence. More disturbing was the implication that this chamber had remained undisturbed since the day of its sealing, suggesting that whatever secrets lay within had been successfully hidden from tomb robbers, officials, and scholars for generations. Keti carefully examined the seal's impressions, using techniques his mother had taught him for studying damaged inscriptions. The clay revealed details that confirmed his growing suspicions about the pyramid's true purpose. The cartouche belonged to a pharaoh whose reign had been erased from official records, but the seal's craftsmanship and materials indicated royal authority of the highest level. This wasn't the tomb of a minor noble or forgotten prince. It contained someone whose very existence had been deemed too dangerous to acknowledge. The doorway's discovery forced an urgent consultation between mother and son about how to proceed. Kamsit examined the seal with the knowledge of someone who understood both its historical significance and its potential dangers. Her literacy allowed her to recognize the formal language used in the protective spells carved around the entrance, warnings that spoke not just of supernatural consequences, but of very real political hazards that could destroy anyone who revealed the chamber's contents. Their research into the mysterious pharaoh's identity revealed fragments of information that painted a disturbing picture of palace intrigue and violent succession disputes. References in obscure texts hinted at a ruler whose legitimate claim to the throne had been challenged by powerful court factions. The official histories recorded his death as the result of sudden illness, but the circumstances of his burial suggested something far more sinister had occurred. Old Seneb's reaction to news of the sealed chamber confirmed their worst fears about the political implications of their discovery. The elderly craftsman's face went pale when Keti described the intact royal seal, and he immediately began speaking of the dangers that such knowledge could bring to anyone foolish enough to pursue it further. His father's generation had been sworn to secrecy about their work in the pyramid, precisely because the truth it contained could threaten the current dynasty's legitimacy. The debate between proceeding with the investigation and abandoning their dangerous course consumed long evening hours around their small campfire. Kamsit understood that opening the sealed chamber would cross a line from which there could be no retreat. Whatever they discovered would become knowledge they couldn't safely ignore or forget, information that would make them threats to powerful people who had spent generations protecting their secrets, but the potential rewards of the discovery also weighed heavily in their deliberations. If the chamber truly contained evidence of the forgotten pharaoh's legitimate reign and the circumstances of his death, such proof could provide them with political leverage that might transform their circumstances from desperate poverty to positions of influence and security. The risk was enormous, but so was the possible return on their dangerous investment. Keti found himself torn between the excitement of historical discovery and the growing awareness of forces beyond his control or understanding. The sealed doorway represented a threshold between his current life as an anonymous slave son and a future filled with possibilities he couldn't fully imagine. Whether that future would prove glorious or catastrophic remained to be seen, but the choice to proceed had become unavoidable. The royal seal impression became the symbol of their moment of decision, the point where scholarly curiosity would either retreat in the face of political reality or advance despite the potentially deadly consequences of revelation. The decision to break the royal seal came at dawn on a morning when desert winds carried the scent of distant storms. Kamsit had spent the night in prayer and contemplation, while Keti lay awake staring at stars that seemed to pulse with anticipation. They both understood that opening the sealed chamber would irrevocably alter their lives, but the pull of discovery had become stronger than their fear of consequences. Using the bronze prying bar with surgical precision, Keti worked to separate the limestone blocks without damaging the precious clay seal more than absolutely necessary. The work required hours of patient effort, as each stone had to be shifted gradually to prevent the entire structure from collapsing. His mother carefully preserved every fragment of the broken seal, wrapping the clay pieces in linen so that the cartouche impressions might be studied later or even reassembled if circumstances required it. When the opening finally became large enough to permit entry, a rush of air emerged from the chamber beyond, not the stale atmosphere of a sealed tomb, but something that carried hints of preserved organic materials and metallic objects that had remained untouched for generations. The scent was unlike anything either of them had encountered, a mixture of ancient incense, precious woods, and something that might have been gold or silver, maintaining its luster in the dry desert air. Keti entered first, his oil lamp casting dancing shadows on walls that gleamed with polished limestone and painted decorations that remained vivid despite the centuries. The chamber was larger than the storage rooms he had explored previously, its ceiling high enough to stand upright comfortably, its floor paved with stones that had been cut and fitted with extraordinary precision. But what dominated the space was the wealth arrayed along the chamber's walls, golden objects that reflected lamplight like captured sunlight. The burial goods exceeded anything either of them had imagined possible. Golden furniture inlaid with precious stones lined the walls, while chests of cedar and ebony stood ready to yield their contents to investigation. Canopic jars of materials they couldn't immediately identify held positions of honor near what appeared to be a sarcophagus of black granite, its surface carved with hieroglyphs that seemed to move in the flickering light. But the object that captured Ketty's immediate attention was a canopic jar unlike any he had seen in his mother's texts or heard described in temple ceremonies. Instead of the traditional limestone or pottery, this container had been crafted from gold, so pure it seemed to glow with inner light. The jar's lid bore the carved head of a deity he didn't recognize, and its surface was covered with inscriptions that appeared to record not just the usual burial formulas, but detailed historical accounts. Musette entered the chamber behind her son, her breath catching as she surveyed the impossible wealth surrounding them. The golden canopic jar drew her attention as well, and her superior knowledge of hieroglyphic writing allowed her to begin deciphering the inscriptions that covered its surface. What she read there confirmed their most daring theories while revealing implications that dwarfed their previous understanding. The jar contained not just the preserved organs of the mysterious pharaoh, but records of his reign that painted a picture of legitimate rule interrupted by treachery and violence. The inscriptions described a king who had attempted to reform corrupt practices among the nobility and priesthood, whose policies had threatened the wealth and influence of powerful court factions. His death hadn't been the result of sudden illness, but of poison administered by conspirators who had then systematically erased his memory from official records. The wealth in the chamber represented more than royal burial goods. It was evidence of a functioning government and prosperous kingdom that had been deliberately forgotten. The golden objects bore dates and inscriptions that established the murdered pharaoh's reign as legitimate and successful, directly contradicting the official histories that portrayed the current dynasty as the rightful inheritors. As they explored further, mother and son discovered that the chamber contained not just burial goods, but a complete archive of the forgotten reign. Papyrus scrolls preserved in sealed containers held administrative records, correspondence with foreign rulers, and most dangerously, detailed accounts of the conspiracy that had led to the pharaoh's assassination and the usurpation of his throne. The golden canopic jar became the symbol of their transformed circumstances, proof that they had discovered something beyond treasure, evidence that could reshape the understanding of recent Egyptian history, while potentially destroying the current royal family's claim to legitimacy. Among the papyrus scrolls preserved in the burial chamber, one document stood out with such political significance that Moset's hands shook as she unrolled its carefully preserved surface. The papyrus bore the formal seals and ceremonial language of a royal succession decree, but its contents revealed truth that could topple the current dynasty and plunge Egypt into civil war. The document established beyond question that the forgotten pharaoh had been the legitimate heir to the throne, murdered by the ancestors of the family that now claimed divine right to rule. The succession papyrus detailed a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of Egyptian society, involving not just palace officials but temple priests who had blessed the usurpation and nobles who had profited from the redistribution of the murdered king's lands and titles. The document named names, listed payments, and described the systematic campaign to erase all evidence of the legitimate ruler's existence from official records and public monuments. Reading the ancient text felt like uncovering a deadly serpent that had been sleeping beneath their feet. Musette realized that her scholarly curiosity had led them into possession of information that powerful people had spent generations ensuring remained buried. The current pharaoh's grandfather had been not a divinely chosen ruler, but a successful assassin who had built his dynasty on murder and deception. The political implications extended far beyond historical accuracy into immediate, life-threatening danger for anyone who possessed such knowledge. The current royal family's legitimacy rested entirely on the fiction that the forgotten pharaoh had never existed, that their ancestors' claim to the throne had been uncontested and blessed by the gods. Proof of their foundational lie would justify rebellion by any number of competing claimants who could trace their lineage to more legitimate sources. Ketty struggled to understand why such dangerous information had been preserved rather than destroyed along with the murdered pharaoh. His mother explained that the ancient Egyptians believed historical truth was essential for the proper functioning of cosmic order, that lies told in the earthly realm would eventually demand accounting in the afterlife. The conspirators had apparently feared that completely obliterating their victims' memory would bring divine punishment, so they had settled for burying the truth rather than destroying it entirely. The burial chamber became a terrifying trap as mother and son realized the impossibility of their situation. They couldn't safely reveal their discoveries without bringing the full power of the state down upon their heads. But they also couldn't pretend ignorance of knowledge that demanded action. The forgotten pharaoh's murder cried out for justice, yet seeking that justice would almost certainly result in their own deaths. Khemwaset found herself questioning the wisdom of the desperate gamble that had brought them to this moment. The 3 gold coins she had spent to purchase the ruined pyramid had seemed like her family's last hope for a better future. But now she wondered if she had actually purchased their doom. The wealth surrounding them in the burial chamber was meaningless if they couldn't survive long enough to benefit from it. The papyrus of succession became both treasure and curse, proof of their discovery's historical importance and end of the deadly secret they now carried. Every hieroglyph on its surface represented knowledge that the current dynasty would kill to suppress, information that transformed them from anonymous slaves into mortal threats to the stability of the kingdom. Their debate about how to proceed consumed sleepless nights and anxious days as they wrestled with possibilities that ranged from fleeing Egypt entirely to attempting some form of accommodation with the current rulers. Each option carried risks that seemed overwhelming for people with no political connections, no military protection, and no experience navigating the treacherous currents of palace intrigue. Old Seneb's warnings about the dangers of their investigation now seemed prophetic rather than superstitious. The craftsman had understood that some secrets were preserved by violence rather than time, that powerful families would not hesitate to eliminate threats to their continued dominance. The pyramid's reputation for bringing misfortune to those who disturbed it might have been based not on supernatural curses, but on very real consequences awaiting anyone who uncovered its political secrets. The succession papyrus represented the moment when their archaeological discovery transformed into a political conspiracy that could cost them their lives. The document in Khemwaset's trembling hands held the power to change history, but wielding that power safely would require wisdom and resources they didn't possess. The forgotten pharaoh's murder had created a debt that demanded payment, but collecting on that debt might require sacrifices that neither mother nor son was prepared to make. The priest Amenemhab had built his career on careful observation and meticulous record-keeping, qualities that made him valuable to the temple hierarchy and dangerous to anyone hoping to conduct secret activities within his district. As the keeper of census records for the Memphis region, he maintained detailed accounts of property ownership, population changes, and commercial transactions that provided the temple with both tax revenue and political intelligence about local activities. The unusual land purchase had caught his attention immediately when the records reached his office for official registration. A slave woman acquiring ownership of a ruined pyramid was extraordinary enough to warrant investigation, but the price paid, 3 gold coins for property that should have been worthless, suggested either hidden knowledge or dangerous foolishness. Either possibility demanded closer scrutiny from someone with authority to act on behalf of temple interests. Amenemhab's initial inquiries had revealed disturbing patterns that set his professional instincts on high alert. The woman Kamwaset possessed literacy skills far beyond what any slave should have acquired, while her son showed signs of education in hieroglyphic writing that indicated systematic instruction rather than casual learning. Their activities at the pyramid site had been noticed by local workers who reported unusual excavation efforts and extended periods spent within the ruins. The temple census record he maintained showed not just property transactions, but detailed information about the individuals involved in each purchase. Kamwaset's entry revealed connections to the household of Amenhotep, the grain merchant, a man whose business dealings brought him into contact with palace officials and whose private scrolls might contain information about pyramid construction projects from previous reigns. The possibility that she had acquired dangerous knowledge through access to archived documents created urgent concerns about what she might have discovered. His investigation had expanded to include discreet inquiries about the pyramid's history and the circumstances of its abandonment. The official records were notably sparse for a royal monument, containing only brief mentions of construction beginning and ending without explanation or ceremony. Such gaps in documentation typically indicated political sensitivity that had required careful suppression of details that might prove embarrassing or dangerous to current rulers. More troubling were the whispered accounts from elderly workers who remembered stories their fathers had told about secret construction work conducted at the pyramid after its official abandonment. These tales spoke of trusted craftsmen who had been paid substantial sums to return to the site and perform modifications that weren't recorded in any architectural plans. The workers had been sworn to secrecy about their activities, but time had loosened some tongues enough to reveal hints of hidden chambers and sealed passages. Amenemhab's position within the temple hierarchy provided him with access to religious archives that contained information not available to secular scholars. Among the ancient texts were references to political controversies from the previous generation, including veiled allusions to succession disputes that had been resolved through divine intervention rather than traditional inheritance. Reading between the lines of these carefully worded documents revealed a pattern of irregularities that suggested the current dynasty's legitimacy might be more questionable than official histories acknowledge. The priests' growing suspicions had been confirmed by reports from villagers who described increased activity at the pyramid site, including evidence of interior excavation and the discovery of objects that the occupants had attempted to conceal. Local children spoke of seeing the boy carrying carved stones and metal tools that appeared to be ancient artifacts removed from within the monument. Such discoveries would normally be reported to temple authorities for proper evaluation and custody. His political connections extended beyond the local temple to include correspondence with palace officials who shared his concerns about potential threats to royal authority. The current pharaoh's administration had shown particular sensitivity to any challenges regarding succession legitimacy, responding harshly to even minor questions about the divine approval of their rule. Knowledge that could cast doubt on the dynasty's rightful claim to the throne would be considered an existential threat requiring immediate elimination. The census record became Amenemhab's weapon for forcing a confrontation with the pyramid's occupants while maintaining the appearance of routine administrative oversight. By documenting their property ownership and activities in official temple records, he could justify demanding access to inspect their discoveries while building a case for confiscating any artifacts that properly belonged to religious rather than private custody. His carefully planned approach would begin with seemingly routine inquiries about property taxes and registration requirements, gradually escalating to direct accusations if the occupants failed to cooperate with temple authority. The priest understood that patience and official procedure would be more effective than dramatic confrontation for uncovering whatever secrets the ruined pyramid might contain. The wax tablet arrived at their pyramid camp with the formal weight of official authority, carried by a uniformed messenger who waited impatiently while Kamwaset read the summons that would force her into direct confrontation with forces she had hoped to avoid. The tablet bore the seal of Kentika, district governor of the Memphis region, and its carefully worded text demanded her immediate appearance before a tribunal that would investigate irregularities in her property ownership and activity. The summons represented escalation beyond anything Kamwasit had anticipated in her worst fears about discovery. Temple priest inquiries could potentially be deflected through careful responses and strategic misdirection, but gubernatorial intervention indicated that their secret had attracted attention at the highest levels of local government. The district governor possessed authority to confiscate property, impose penalties, and even order imprisonment for activities deemed threatening to public order. Ketty watched his mother prepare for what might prove to be their final confrontation with official authority. She selected her most respectable clothing, practiced responses to likely questions, and gathered documents that might support their legal position regarding pyramid ownership. But they both understood that bureaucratic procedures were merely formalities that would give official sanction to whatever decision had already been made about their fate. The journey to the governor's compound required crossing Memphis during daylight hours, when their absence from the pyramid would be noted by anyone conducting surveillance of their activities. Kamwasit made careful arrangements for concealing their most dangerous discoveries while ensuring that valuable artifacts remained accessible if negotiations provided opportunities for strategic revelation. The succession papyrus and golden canopic jar were hidden in locations that only she and Ketty knew, insurance against confiscation or worse fates. The gubernatorial palace overwhelmed them with displays of wealth and power, designed to intimidate petitioners and demonstrate the futility of challenging official authority. Guards in ceremonial armor flanked doorways that led to chambers decorated with murals depicting the governor's achievements and royal connection. The message was clear: resistance to official demands would be crushed with overwhelming force, while cooperation might earn consideration for less harsh treatment. Governor Kentika proved to be a man whose political survival had depended on careful attention to threats that might compromise his relationship with higher authorities. His interrogation revealed detailed knowledge of their activities that could only have come from systematic surveillance conducted over weeks or months. She knew about Ketty's excavation work, about their discovery of carved stones and metal artifacts, and most dangerously, about their extended periods within the pyramid's interior chambers. The governor's primary concern wasn't archaeological curiosity, but political security. He spoke carefully about reports that had reached palace officials regarding potential discoveries that might affect royal interests. His questions focused on whether they had found documents or objects that contained historical information about previous reigns, particularly materials that might contradict official accounts of dynastic succession. The line of inquiry revealed how close they had come to detection by the most dangerous possible enemies. Kamwasit's responses required balancing honesty with survival instincts, admitting enough knowledge to appear cooperative while concealing information that would prove immediately fatal. She acknowledged discovering carved stones and metal objects within the pyramid, but characterized them as ordinary construction materials and workers' tools rather than royal artifacts of historical significance. Her literacy skills allowed her to navigate the complex legal language used in official proceedings, but she could sense the governor's growing suspicion about her evasive answers. The interrogation revealed a web of noble families who had expressed interest in claiming ownership of the pyramid site for their own purposes. Several prominent households had apparently approached the governor with offers to purchase the property at prices far exceeding its apparent value, suggesting they possessed knowledge about its contents that hadn't been shared with current occupants. These wealthy competitors represented immediate threats that would persist regardless of how the current proceedings concluded. The governor's final demand proved more sophisticated than simple confiscation or punishment. He offered a bargain that would allow them to retain nominal ownership of the pyramid while accepting protection from a noble family that would provide security in exchange for shared access to whatever discoveries might emerge from future excavation work. The proposal was phrased as generous consideration for their cooperation, but its true nature as extortion disguised by legal formalities was unmistakable. The wax tablet summons had opened a door to negotiations that neither mother nor son had expected, but the price of survival was proving to be the surrender of control over their destiny to forces whose ultimate intentions remained unclear and potentially deadly. The royal messenger arrived like a storm made flesh, his approach announced by the thunder of horse hooves and the glint of polished bronze that marked him as bearing communications from the highest authority in the land. His ring bore the cartouche of the reigning pharaoh, its gold surface catching the morning sunlight as he dismounted and approached their humble camp with the confident stride of someone who had never been denied anything he demanded in the name of divine authority. Kamwaset felt her world contract to the size of a grain of sand as she recognized the implications of royal attention. District governors could be negotiated with, temple priests could be deflected through careful responses, but pharaonic interest meant that their secret had reached the pinnacle of Egyptian power. The messenger's presence transformed their archaeological discovery into a matter of state security that would be resolved through methods far more direct and final than legal proceedings. The message he carried was brief but devastating in its implication. Pharaoh Khafre demanded Kamwaset's immediate presence at the royal palace in Memphis, where she would provide detailed accounts of her activities at the pyramid site and surrender any artifacts or documents discovered during her excavations. The summons mentioned specific items that could only have been described by someone with intimate knowledge of the burial chamber's contents, suggesting that their security had been compromised at the highest levels. The messenger's ring served as both credential and threat, its royal seal proclaiming authority that transcended all other considerations of law, custom, or personal safety. The pharaoh's cartouche engraved in its golden surface represented power that had been exercised without challenge for generations, command that could order the death of thousands with the same casual ease used for minor administrative decisions. To refuse the summons would be treason punishable by death, but compliance might prove equally fatal if their discoveries threatened royal legitimacy. Keti watched his mother prepare for what they both understood might be their final separation. She selected the most impressive artifacts from their discoveries that could serve as evidence of cooperation, while concealing the most dangerous documents that proved the current dynasty's illegitimate foundation. The succession papyrus remained hidden in the pyramid's secret chambers, but she carried copies of less threatening inscriptions that might satisfy royal curiosity without revealing the full scope of their knowledge. The journey to the royal palace required traveling through Memphis in a procession that announced their importance to anyone observing their passage. The messenger's escort included guards whose primary purpose was ensuring arrival rather than providing protection, making clear that flight or resistance would be met with immediate and overwhelming force. Citizens who saw them pass whispered among themselves about what crimes might have brought such official attention to people of obviously modest circumstances. The palace overwhelmed them with displays of wealth and power that dwarfed even the governor's impressive compound. Gold-plated columns supported ceilings decorated with precious stones, while floors of polished marble reflected light from oil lamps burning perfumed oils imported from distant lands. Every surface proclaimed the divine authority of Egypt's ruler and the futility of challenging royal will through any means other than complete submission. Pharaoh Khafre proved to be younger than Kamwaset had expected, but his eyes held the calculating intelligence of someone who had inherited not just a throne, but the political sophistication required to maintain power in a world where legitimacy could be challenged through historical revelation. His questions revealed knowledge of their discoveries that could only have come from sources within their own circle, suggesting that someone close to them had been reporting their activities to palace authorities. The pharaoh's primary concern wasn't the monetary value of their archaeological finds, but the political implications of any documents that might cast doubt on his family's right to rule. He spoke carefully about the importance of maintaining historical accuracy while ensuring that ancient disputes didn't destabilize contemporary governance. His meaning was clear: cooperation in suppressing dangerous knowledge would be rewarded, while attempts to use such information for personal advantage would be eliminated. The royal audience revealed a level of political sophistication that neither Kamwaset nor Keti had expected from absolute rulers. Rather than simply confiscating their discoveries through force, the pharaoh proposed arrangements that would transform them from potential threats into valuable assets, whose continued well-being would depend on maintaining the secrecy that protected royal legitimacy. The messenger's ring had delivered them, not to execution, but to negotiation, though the stakes remained their lives and the future of their discoveries. The throne room's oppressive grandeur seemed designed to reduce petitioners to trembling submission, but Kamwaset found herself studying the pharaoh's signet ring with the analytical mind of a scholar rather than the terror of a condemned criminal. The massive golden seal bore symbols that proclaimed divine authority, but she recognized subtle differences from the cartouches she had studied in ancient texts. The current dynasty's legitimacy claims were encoded in those hieroglyphs, and her knowledge of the forgotten pharaoh's true succession rites made every symbol a lie carved in precious metal. Pharaoh Khafre leaned forward on his throne of electrum and ivory, his penetrating gaze fixed on the woman who possessed knowledge that could destroy everything his family had built over 2 generations. His advisors flanked the throne in careful formation. The vizier, whose political survival depended on maintaining royal authority, the high priest, whose temple's wealth flowed from pharaonic patronage, and the military commander, whose power derived from protecting the dynasty against all enemies, foreign and domestic. "You have discovered something in that ruined pyramid," the pharaoh stated with the quiet certainty of absolute power. "Something that my grandfather believed had been buried so completely that it would never again see daylight. Yet here you stand, a former slave, who somehow acquired literacy and archaeological knowledge that led you directly to secrets that trained scholars have failed to locate for 50 years. Kamwasit chose her words with the precision of someone navigating a minefield where any misstep would prove fatal. She acknowledged finding burial goods and inscriptions within the pyramid, but characterized them as evidence of ancient craftsmanship rather than documents that could reshape understanding of recent dynastic history. Her careful responses revealed enough knowledge to demonstrate cooperation while concealing the most dangerous discoveries that could justify immediate execution. The pharaoh's offer surprised everyone present with its sophistication and political calculation. Rather than simply eliminating the threat through violence, he proposed transforming Kamwasit from enemy into ally through arrangements that would benefit both parties while ensuring the dangerous knowledge remained safely controlled. Her son would be elevated to a position within the palace administration where his education could serve royal interests, while she would receive freedom and property that would ensure her comfortable silence. The negotiations that followed revealed the complex political calculations underlying absolute rule. The pharaoh couldn't simply destroy evidence of his grandfather's crimes without risking divine displeasure that might manifest through natural disasters, military defeats, or popular unrest. Ancient Egyptian beliefs about cosmic justice demanded that historical truths eventually receive acknowledgement, even if that recognition came through private ceremonies rather than public proclamation. Palace intrigues swirled around the negotiations as various court factions recognized opportunities to advance their own interests through the arrangements being discussed. The vizier saw possibilities for strengthening his position by demonstrating loyalty to pharaonic security, while the high priest calculated ways to ensure temple authority over any religious artifacts that might emerge from the pyramid's chambers. The military commander focused on eliminating potential threats to dynastic stability while avoiding actions that might create martyrs or inspire additional investigations. Kamwaset found herself bargaining not just for survival, but for the future of the knowledge she had uncovered. The forgotten pharaoh's murder demanded some form of justice, even if that meant private acknowledgement rather than public vindication. She proposed arrangements that would allow proper burial rites for the assassinated ruler, while ensuring that dangerous political revelations remained confined to those who already possessed security clearances for such sensitive information. The pharaoh's signet ring became the seal that would formalize their dangerous compact. Its authority would transform them from slaves into royal servants whose continued well-being would depend on maintaining the secrecy that protected dynastic legitimacy. The ring's power could elevate them to positions of influence and security, but it could also crush them if they proved untrustworthy or attempted to exploit their knowledge for personal advantage beyond what the pharaoh was willing to grant. Court officials drew up documents that would legally establish the new arrangements, while carefully avoiding any written acknowledgement of the historical discoveries that had made such agreements necessary. Kamwaset's manumission from slavery would be recorded as recognition of her literacy skills, while Keti's appointment to palace service would appear to result from his demonstrated intelligence rather than his dangerous knowledge of buried secrets. The throne room negotiations concluded with formal ceremonies that transformed their legal status while binding them to oaths of silence that would be enforced through methods both subtle and overwhelming. The pharaoh's ring had sealed their fate as surely as it sealed official documents, creating a future that offered unprecedented opportunities, shadowed by equally unprecedented danger. The ivory pallet inlaid with gold arrived at their pyramid camp 3 days after the palace negotiations, carried by a junior scribe whose nervousness suggested he understood the significance of the gift he transported. The writing implements bore the cartouche of the Royal Scribal School, marking them as tools reserved for students destined for the highest levels of palace administration. For Keti, the palette represented transformation from anonymous slave son to educated official whose literacy would serve pharaonic interests. Keti held the precious writing tools, with hands that trembled despite his attempts to project confidence worthy of his new position. The ivory surface was smooth as silk beneath his fingers, while the gold inlay caught sunlight like captured fire. Reed pens of perfect balance rested in carved holders beside cakes of ink that had been mixed with ingredients imported from distant lands. These weren't tools for a village scribe or merchant's clerk. They were instruments of power that could draft laws, record treaties, and shape the administrative decisions that governed millions of lives. The internal conflict that consumed him went far beyond normal anxiety about new responsibilities. Accepting the position meant abandoning his mother at precisely the moment when their dangerous knowledge made her most vulnerable to enemies who might emerge from shadows they couldn't predict or control. The palace appointment offered security and advancement that exceeded his wildest childhood dreams, but the price was separation from the person who had sacrificed everything to create opportunities he hadn't initially wanted. His mother's reaction to the scribal appointment revealed the depth of strategic thinking that had guided her decisions from the beginning. She had never expected to benefit directly from their archaeological discoveries, but had always intended that Keti would use whatever they found to escape the limitations of his birth circumstances. The palace position represented success beyond her most optimistic projections, validation that her desperate gamble with 3 gold coins had achieved its ultimate purpose. But acceptance also meant embracing complicity in the cover-up of historical crimes that demanded justice. The forgotten pharaoh's murder would remain unavenged. His legitimate claim to the throne unrecognized, his memory confined to secret chambers that few people would ever see. Keti would become part of the system that perpetuated lies about dynastic succession, using his literacy skills to strengthen the very authority that had been built on his predecessor's assassination. The scribal school's training regimen would immerse him in palace culture where loyalty to current rulers was assumed rather than questioned. His fellow students would be sons of nobles and high officials who had never doubted the legitimacy of pharaonic authority, who viewed historical scholarship as confirmation of royal divinity rather than investigation of political reality. He would need to conceal not just his background, but his knowledge of truth that could destroy the foundations of everything his colleagues believed. Preparation for his new role required careful consideration of which aspects of his education to reveal and which to conceal. His literacy skills were impressive for someone of his apparent background, but revealing their full extent might prompt investigations into how a slave son had acquired such sophisticated training. He would need to appear talented but not suspiciously so, educated but within believable parameters for his official background story. The palace position also offered unprecedented opportunities to protect other enslaved people whose circumstances resembled his own family's previous situation. Administrative positions provided access to legal procedures that could be manipulated to benefit those without political connections, while scribal duties included documenting property transactions that could be influenced to favor worthy cases. His elevation would allow him to extend help to people who needed advocates within the bureaucratic systems that typically ignored their interests. His mother's pride in his advancement was tempered by realistic understanding of the dangers that would follow him into palace service. Court intrigue was deadly to those who lacked political sophistication, while knowledge of dangerous secrets made him valuable but also expendable if circumstances changed. She provided final lessons in diplomacy and discretion that might preserve his life during the transition from pyramid dweller to royal servant. The scribal palette became both tool and symbol of his transformation, representing education's power to transcend birth circumstances, while demanding loyalty to authorities whose legitimacy he privately questioned. Its ivory surface would record documents that strengthened dynastic control, while its golden inlay reflected light that reminded him of treasures hidden in chambers that most scribes would never imagine existed. The choice to accept the palace appointment meant choosing survival and advancement over justice and historical truth, pragmatic accommodation over principled resistance to powerful lies that shaped their civilization's understanding of its own past. The papyrus document that legally freed Khaimaset from slavery bore official seals that transformed her from property into person, with rights that could be enforced through courts and protected by law. The Banished Papers, written in the formal language of legal liberation, cited her exceptional literacy skills and valuable services to the crown as justification for her elevation from bondage to citizenship. No mention appeared of archaeological discoveries or dangerous historical knowledge. Officially, her freedom resulted from academic ability rather than political necessity. The transformation felt surreal as Khaimaset examined the document that redefined her entire existence. For decades, she had been legally classified as her master's possession, her labor and even her life subject to his will and disposition. The papyrus changed everything with written words that commanded respect from officials who had previously treated her as barely human. She could now own property, enter contracts, testify in legal proceedings, and most importantly, make decisions about her future without requiring permission from any master. The estate granted as part of her freedom exceeded anything she had imagined possible during her years of servitude. The property included not just the pyramid site they had already claimed, but additional lands near Memphis that generated rental income from tenant farmers. The arrangement provided financial security while ensuring she remained in the region where palace officials could monitor her activities and ensure continued cooperation with royal interests. Her new legal status created unexpected challenges as former slaves learned to navigate freedoms they had never experienced. Simple decisions about daily activities required conscious thought when no master's schedule dictated her movements. Social interactions became complex negotiations as people adjusted to treating her as an equal rather than property. Even former fellow slaves struggled with the changed relationship, uncertain whether to celebrate her elevation or resent her escape from their shared circumstance. The respect she now commanded from neighbors and officials stemmed from more than just legal documentation. Her literacy skills and obvious education elevated her beyond typical freed slaves into the ranks of intellectuals whose opinions carried weight in community discussions. Local temple priests consulted her about interpretation of difficult texts, while government officials sought her assistance with administrative problems that required sophisticated reading comprehension. But the respect came with scrutiny that made her constantly aware of forces watching for any signs of disloyalty or attempts to exploit her dangerous knowledge. Palace agents maintained discreet surveillance of her activities, while temple officials monitored her interactions with scholars and officials who might be influenced by revelations about historical secrets. Her freedom was real, but bounded by invisible constraints that could become deadly if she attempted to exceed their limits. The property management responsibilities that accompanied her new status required skills she had never developed during years of following orders rather than making decisions. Tenant farmers expected guidance about crop selection and market timing, while maintenance of buildings and irrigation systems demanded understanding of construction and engineering principles. Her education had prepared her to read ancient texts, but not to manage modern agricultural enterprises. Gradually, however, the challenge of property management became a source of satisfaction that rivaled her previous scholarly pursuits. Working with tenant farmers to improve crop yields required the same analytical thinking she had applied to historical research, while negotiations with merchants and officials drew upon diplomatic skills developed during her dangerous interactions with palace authorities. The estate provided not just income but intellectual engagement that kept her mind active and growing. Her changed circumstances allowed her to establish connections with other educated women whose intelligence had been constrained by social expectations rather than legal bondage. These relationships provided intellectual stimulation and practical advice about navigating the complex social hierarchies that governed interactions between people of different backgrounds and capabilities. She discovered communities of learning that had existed beyond her awareness during years of enforced ignorance about opportunities available to free citizens. The Manumission document represented more than personal liberation. It symbolized the power of knowledge to transform circumstances that had seemed permanently fixed. Her literacy had not only enabled the archaeological discoveries that changed their lives, but provided the foundation for all subsequent opportunities that followed from those initial revelations. Education had been both the tool that uncovered dangerous secrets and the qualification that justified the royal arrangements protecting those secrets. Her reflection on the journey from slave to citizen revealed how one desperate decision had created cascading consequences that transformed not just her legal status, but her understanding of human potential and the possibilities available to those willing to risk everything for knowledge that others feared to seek. The royal decree that Ketty drafted in his elegant hieroglyphic script bore the official seal that marked his full acceptance into the palace administration's inner circle. The document concerned grain distribution policies for Memphis district farmers, routine administrative business that demonstrated his competence with legal language and bureaucratic procedures. But for Kamboset, reading her son's careful calligraphy on papyrus that bore pharaonic authority represented the culmination of everything she had hoped to achieve through her desperate gamble with 3 gold coins. His position as court scribe provided access to information and influence that neither of them had imagined possible during their days of living among pyramid ruins. The palace appointment included not just clerical duties, but advisory responsibilities that brought him into regular contact with high officials who valued his analytical skills and educational background. His insights about historical precedents and legal interpretations had begun to shape policy decisions that affected thousands of citizens throughout the kingdom. The secret communication system they had developed allowed mother and son to maintain their connection despite the physical separation required by his court duties. Coded references embedded in routine correspondence enabled them to share information about palace politics and archaeological discoveries without revealing their relationship to surveillance systems that monitored all official communication. Their shared knowledge of the forgotten pharaoh's story provided context for understanding current political maneuvering that would have been opaque to observers without such historical perspective. Ketty's growing influence within palace administration provided opportunities to protect enslaved people whose circumstances resembled his family's previous situation. Administrative procedures that typically favored wealthy citizens could be subtly modified to benefit those without political connections, while legal interpretations could be crafted to expand protections for vulnerable populations. His position allowed him to pursue justice through bureaucratic channels, even when historical justice remained impossible to achieve. The first official document bearing his signature had been a routine property transfer, but subsequent decrees had addressed increasingly important matters of state policy and legal precedent. His superiors had recognized intellectual capabilities that exceeded those of typical court scribes, leading to assignments that required sophisticated analysis rather than mere copying of predetermined text. The progression from clerk to advisor represented advancement that would have been unthinkable for someone of his background under normal circumstances. His influence extended beyond administrative duties into informal networks that shaped palace opinion and policy direction. Younger scribes sought his guidance on complex legal questions, while established officials valued his perspective on historical precedents that informed contemporary decision-making. The education his mother had provided, combined with unique insights gained from their archaeological discoveries, had equipped him with knowledge that proved valuable in contexts far removed from pyramid chambers. The secret knowledge of dynastic illegitimacy that he carried provided understanding of palace politics that allowed him to navigate court intrigue with unusual sophistication. Recognizing which officials were aware of historical irregularities and which remained ignorant enabled him to build alliances while avoiding dangerous enemies. His position offered protection through usefulness, but also created vulnerabilities if his background knowledge became perceived as threatening rather than valuable. Regular correspondence with his mother revealed how their separation had allowed both to flourish in ways that might not have been possible if they had remained together. Her estate management had developed into successful agricultural enterprise that provided economic security, while his administrative career had opened opportunities for influencing policy and protecting vulnerable population. Their individual success had multiplied the impact of their original discovery, rather than dividing it. The palace environment had initially seemed alien and intimidating, but Keti had learned to appreciate the sophisticated culture that surrounded pharaonic administration. Access to royal libraries provided opportunities to study texts that existed nowhere else, while interactions with foreign ambassadors and merchants expanded his understanding of the wider world beyond Egypt's borders. His education continued to develop in directions that would have been impossible in his previous circumstances. The transformation from pyramid dweller to palace official had required careful concealment of background knowledge, while demonstrating capabilities that justified his rapid advancement. His success proved that merit could transcend birth circumstances when opportunity aligned with preparation, but it also revealed how much potential was wasted when social systems prevented talented individuals from accessing education and advancement opportunities. His first decree represented not just professional achievement, but vindication of his mother's faith in education's transformative power. The elegant script that bore pharaonic authority had been learned in the shadow of ruined pyramid, where a desperate woman had gambled everything on her son's potential to rise above circumstances that seemed to offer only limitation and servitude. 5 years after their first discovery, Kamwaset returned to the pyramid's deepest chambers with tools and knowledge that would finally reveal its ultimate secret. The golden key she had found concealed within the forgotten pharaoh's sarcophagus had puzzled her for months, its intricate design suggesting mechanisms that existed nowhere in the burial chamber's visible architecture. Only systematic exploration of every wall and surface had revealed the almost invisible keyhole, carved into what appeared to be solid limestone. The key's insertion triggered mechanisms that ancient engineers had designed to function perfectly after centuries of waiting. Stone blocks shifted with whispered precision, revealing a chamber beyond the burial room that hadn't appeared on any of the architectural fragments she had studied. The hidden space was smaller than the main burial chamber, but filled with artifacts that immediately revealed its purpose. This was where the murdered pharaoh's most trusted advisors had preserved evidence of the conspiracy that destroyed their legitimate ruler. Unlike the golden treasures and ceremonial objects that filled the main burial chamber, this final room contained practical evidence of governmental administration during the forgotten reign. Papyrus scrolls detailed military campaigns that had succeeded, diplomatic negotiations that had strengthened Egypt's position, and domestic policies that had improved conditions for common citizens. The documents painted a picture of effective leadership that contradicted official histories portraying the erased pharaoh as ineffective and unpopular. Most devastating to the current dynasty's legitimacy were detailed records of the assassination plot, including correspondence between conspirators that named participants and revealed their motivations. The Golden Key had protected evidence that could destroy not just the royal family, but entire noble houses whose wealth and power had been built upon participation in regicide. The chamber contained the complete truth about events that official histories had distorted beyond recognition. But alongside evidence of ancient crimes, Kamwasut discovered something that transformed her understanding of why the truth had been preserved, rather than destroyed. The murdered pharaoh's final testament, sealed within a container that required the golden key to open, revealed that he had anticipated his assassination and arranged for evidence to be hidden until Egypt was ready for justice, rather than revenge. The testament specified conditions under which the truth should be revealed, emphasizing healing rather than retribution. The testament's wisdom amazed her with its prescient understanding of political consequences that transcended personal justice. The murdered pharaoh had recognized that immediate revelation of the conspiracy would have plunged Egypt into civil war that would have benefited foreign enemies more than domestic justice. His hidden chamber represented patience on a scale that encompassed generations, trusting that future leaders would find ways to acknowledge truth without destroying the stability that protected millions of citizens. Her decision about the final chamber's contents required weighing competing obligations that went beyond personal survival to encompass responsibilities for Egypt's future stability. The evidence could expose historical crimes, but might also destabilize contemporary governance in ways that would harm innocent people more than guilty ones. The murdered pharaoh's testament offered guidance but couldn't resolve dilemmas that belonged to her generation rather than his. After extensive contemplation and private discussions with Keti during his carefully arranged visits, Kamwasut chose a course that honored both justice and wisdom. Selected evidence from the chamber would be preserved in temple archives, where qualified scholars could access it for historical research, while the most politically dangerous documents would remain sealed until future generations could address their implications without risking contemporary chaos. The Golden Key became the symbol of measured revelation rather than explosive exposure, representing the patient approach to justice that the murdered pharaoh had envisioned. Future pharaohs would eventually learn the truth about their dynasty's origins, but in contexts that allowed for acknowledgement and reconciliation rather than persecution and revenge. The pyramid that had begun as worthless ruins had become a monument to the power of knowledge preserved through patience and wisdom. Her 3 gold coins had purchased not just archaeological treasures, but understanding that some truths required generations to unfold properly. The desperate gamble of a slave woman had evolved into carefully planned revelation that would shape Egypt's understanding of its own history for centuries to come. Her final visit to the burial chamber included ceremonies that honored both the murdered pharaoh and the future rulers who would eventually confront the complete truth about their inheritance. The golden key that had revealed the ultimate secrets would be preserved alongside evidence that future generations might prove wise enough to address with justice that healed rather than destroyed.